2.5 years ago, the streets of Wellington were consumed by chaos and conflict. Political tensions exploded as the police descended upon and destroyed a protest camp established by anti-mandate and anti-vaccine protesters. The long-standing protest had established a makeshift community on the Parliament lawn. Frustrated by the protest and some of its more unruly participants, the state orchestrated a crackdown and brought an end to the protest. Masses of heavily armoured police clashed with countless furious protesters. Protesters flung bricks at the police, and rubber bullets and pepper spray came flying back. It was quite something, probably the greatest display of such political conflict since the 1981 Springbok Tour. It could be said that it was politics in its purest form. A loud, emotional, and brutal struggle about how state power should be wielded. A very clear struggle between two groups. Two groups made up of people who undoubtedly possessed an extremely diverse range of political views. And yet a clear divide existed between them, and this divide became the site of intense conflict. I personally witnessed the tail end of this event. I had not seen any news about the protest that day, but I was in Wellington at the time. I decided to take a walk. I decided that I would go and see how the protest was developing, expecting to find nothing special. Upon my arrival to the scene, I was immediately confronted with the sight of an endless sea of police. More police than I had ever seen. Far more police than I had ever seen. By this point, the protest had died down. Nobody was throwing bricks, but the air was still full of smoke from the fires that the protesters had lit. There were angry protesters everywhere. They screamed at the police. Occasionally a small item may be thrown at the police. At this point, more as a display of hostility than as a serious attempt at causing harm. The police stood there. Covered in heavy armour, they formed a shield wall, keeping the protesters away from the reclaimed territory. The displayed photo is one that I took. Ironically, many of the protesters had donned face masks in an effort at obscuring their identities. The energy of the scene was truly unique. It was quite different to anything I have experienced. Two very large angry groups, aggressively facing each other down, produced a certain kind of social energy. The air feels almost electric. It brings you into an almost tribal state. At that moment, I could see how mob violence occurs. How ordinary people can be drawn to impulsively riot or attack police. Not because I agreed with the protesters, for the most part I did not. But because the social energy was simply so captivating. I could see how a more sympathetic person may be drawn to impulsive violence. The protesters appear distinctly human. They are loud and emotional. They all look different. They all look unique. They appear relatable and human, undeniably human. In contrast with the police. The police are silent. They hardly even move. They all look identical. Heavy armour makes them look like machines. Their faces are obscured, hiding their humanity. The police are the agents of the state. Like the state, they were faceless and nameless. Like the state, they appear inhuman. Dressed in identical uniforms and with their faces obscured, they did not look human. Of course they were human, but appearances are powerful things, particularly in a highly emotive environment. One stands among the protesters and faces the police. It is very easy to relate to and identify with the protesters. It is very easy to feel an impulsive hostility towards the police. Not because such views are justified by rational arguments or intellectual considerations, but because the social environment provokes such a reaction. The social environment creates a kind of primitive mob mentality, an us versus them tribal mentality, a with them and against them mentality. It is a very interesting thing. and it helps to explain why people engage in mindless and impulsive acts of mob violence. A very special and very dangerous kind of social energy is at play, the energy of a mindless mob, and I do not say this to praise or insult the protesters, because this is true of protests of any and every political persuasion. The downfall of the protest was a very interesting thing to witness. But what do I actually think of the protest? Who was in the wrong? Who was in the right? It is my view that both the government and the protesters deserve significant criticism. The government response was heavy-handed. They had little interest in a diplomatic solution. They should have made more of an effort to speak with the protesters and find a diplomatic solution. The conflict and chaos that emerged should have been prevented. The government made little effort to prevent this outcome. The protest also had some serious issues. It was infested with violent idiots, people who threatened to hurt and kill politicians, people who wanted to hang politicians. You can't really be that surprised that the politicians don't want to talk to you when you want to murder them. Many of the protesters were bloodthirsty idiots driven by fantasies of retribution. That is just a fact. Of course, this is not true of all of the protesters, but it is true of a great many of them. The protest was the definition of a big tent movement. It was politically diverse to an extreme degree. Eventually this becomes an issue because out of dislike of the government, you find yourself marching with people who are far worse. You care about freedom, but find yourself marching with Christian fundamentalists and far-right authoritarians. Eventually the Big Tent movement becomes politically incoherent with no defining views. It was laughable that many people who supposedly cared about bodily autonomy aligned themselves with a protest that was dominated by anti-abortion activists. They claimed to care about bodily autonomy. Then why was the protest dominated by people who want to criminalize abortion? This kind of thing destroys the credibility of the protest. The protest was supposed to be anti-mandate. I think the opposition to vaccine mandates is understandable. Concern about bodily autonomy and individual freedoms is justified. But the protest was hijacked by deranged anti-vax morons. People who had a totally irrational aversion to the vaccine. People who promoted dangerous anti-vax lies. Vaccines reduce the probability of being killed or hospitalized by COVID-19. Many of the people at the protest promoted opposition to the vaccine. These lies kill people. They are lethal. They discourage people from taking the vaccine that significantly reduces their likelihood of being killed or hospitalized by the virus. The protest had some serious issues. It was hijacked by anti-vaxxers. It lacked serious political principles. It was a big tent with little, if any, coherent messaging. Many of its members were violent morons. They threw bricks at the police. A brick to the head can easily kill a person. I think the government was heavy-handed, but attempting to murder and seriously injure the police is unacceptable. I do recognise that some protesters opposed this violence and tried to stop it, but many did not. Some protesters set the Parliament lawn alight. If this was not an attempt at burning Parliament down, I do not know what it was. The protest had some serious issues. There were valid concerns about individual rights and bodily autonomy, but ultimately the protest destroyed its credibility. The anti-vaxxers, the bloodthirsty idiots, the hypocrisy. The protest had very little political credibility. This is not to say that all of the protesters had no credibility. I do not doubt that some decent and reasonable people were in attendance. But many of the people involved were far from decent and far from reasonable. The protest was a significant moment. It is an important part of our political history, and there are many important political lessons that we can learn from it.